Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar on COVID-19 search strategies in PharmaPendium, where we will focus on drug safety and efficacy. My name is Marnix, and I'm Senior Solution Marketing Manager Drug Safety at Elsevier. I'm joined today by Thomas, who is a PharmaPendium Product Manager for PharmaPendium. Now, before diving in, first a couple of housekeeping comments, I should say. First, we would like to recommend to watch the presentation in full screen mode, and please make sure that your audio is turned on. Then, second, during the webinar, you have the possibility to ask questions by typing these questions into the Ask a Question box. We will address any questions at the end of the webinar. If you have additional questions or if you feel that your questions have not been fully answered, always feel free to send me or Thomas an email or send us a message on LinkedIn. Last, you can access these slides and other links that we talk about during this presentation through the attachment section that you should be able to find below the viewing screen. And now really the last introduction comment is if at the end of the webinar you think this is interesting, I have maybe some more questions, or maybe I would like to discuss how maybe PharmaPendium can help me answer my pharmaceutical R&D questions. At the end, we'll put up a vote. You can simply click yes, and then we should have your contact details and get back to you. If you don't want us to follow up with you, then feel free to ignore this poll as well. Now, for today's session, we would like to first give a brief introduction into how Elsevier is supporting the fight against COVID-19, why PharmaPendium is a critical resource for repurposing of drugs for the treatment of COVID-19 and COVID-19 symptoms. And then we're going to show you three different workflows how around drug safety and efficacy data in PharmaPendium. So first, what adverse effects can I expect when dosing above the recommended therapeutic dose? What medication could aggravate COVID-19 disease symptoms, and what approved drugs have been tested against COVID-19 related indications and symptoms? So it's more like an efficacy related questions. And if time permits, we'll be happy to take some questions as well. Now, hopefully at the end of this meeting, you have some new insights into how drug safety and efficacy data in PharmaPendium can help you with the repurposing of drugs for treatment of COVID-19 infections and COVID-19 symptoms. And for those on the call already using PharmaPendium, you hopefully get some practical insights into finding drug safety and efficacy data in PharmaPendium. So, of course, for this audience, COVID-19 doesn't really need much of an introduction. We are really in the middle of a worldwide pandemic that is really far from under control. Now, at this point, we have close to 2 million new cases every week and over 35,000 deaths every week as well. And of course, next to the healthcare consequences, there is of course major impact on the various economies around the world as well. Of course, it's critical we get this under control as soon as possible. Now, Elsevier, as a data and analytics company with a very strong focus on pharmaceutical R&D, is of course very well positioned to support the fight against COVID-19. Therefore, we have made many data and documents freely available in the Corona Research Information Center. Also, if you are a R&D professional working on COVID-19 related projects, you can apply for access to Elsevier's Coronavirus Research Hub. Now, this Research Hub will give you access to 15 Elsevier solutions that include, for example, ScienceDirect and Scopus, but also PharmaPendium that we'll talk about today. Now, you'll find the links to these resources by clicking on the attachment button under your video player. You can also download this slide deck from there and also click on those links as well. Now, next to, of course, many promising new vaccines that are currently being developed, there are also many existing drugs that are being tested for prevention and treatment of COVID-19 and COVID-19 symptoms. And this is, of course, a very sensible strategy, as developing a totally new drug can take up to 10 years or more and consume, of course, significant amount of resources. Depending on the numbers, it can be somewhere between 500 million and $2 billion US. Testing an already approved drug for a new indication actually makes a lot of sense. As you bypass a very long and expensive development process. Now, to maximize repurposing and treatment success, you really need to be fully informed on all regulatory data available on those drugs that are currently already on the market. Now, regulatory approval documents are, of course, a crucial source of precedent, safety, DMPK, and efficacy information on approved drugs, as this data has been evaluated, commented, and approved of by regulatory authorities. So that's really a crucial data source that you need access to evaluate the potential of repurposing of drugs. Now, most on the call know that really finding information in regulatory documents is really challenging. It's really hard to know where you should be looking for information, and information is available at all. And for example, many FDA approval documents are really scanned image files and cannot be searched in full text and without reading really the full document. And for a couple of examples we're going to show you today, without reading through all available EMA and FDA approval documents available, you would never know if where to look for the relevant information, and it's impossible to do a comprehensive search. Now, one slide into PharmaPendium. How are we kind of addressing these issues? Now, really with PharmaPendium, we are really helping you to overcome these bottlenecks and unlock critical regulatory insights on already approved drugs, thereby positioning you for your repurposing exercises. So how do we do this? We really take EMA and FDA approval documents, but also FDA advisory committee meeting documents, as well as books and journal articles. Then we take all these documents and turn, especially the regulatory documents, into fully text searchable documents. And thereby you can now search these regulatory documents in full text. Then a panel of medical experts reads all these documents in full text and extracts out drug safety data, DMPK data, efficacy data, and more. And then we make these data discoverable by mapping the data to our external as well as in-house developed expert biomedical taxonomies. And some of these indeed are developed by us and therefore exclusively available in PharmaPendium. And then we overlay our database with an intuitive user interface and make the result accessible through, of course, this user interface, but also through export as well as API access. So you can feed the data into analytical modeling solutions as well. So in the end, what we deliver is a searchable indexed database where, importantly, all the data you find is linked back to the original source document. All extracted information is searchable across drug class, as well as chemical structures, and data can be used into analytical tools as well. Now with that, I would suggest Thomas to take over and show us the first workflow example. Okay, now we currently see your BrightTalk. Present the screen, Thomas? Yes, exactly.
You see my screen?
Yeah, we can, yeah. It's that.
Thank you, Marnix. So, the COVID-19 pandemic has prompted worldwide interest in the repurposing of drugs. With COVID-19 now affecting the entire world and no vaccine or treatment yet approved, researchers are looking at the potential of many existing approved drugs. Although repurposed drugs is an interesting strategy to get the market quicker without the long and cumbersome normal cycle of a new drug, it is not without risk of failure if you miss crucial information. For example, on what was already reported for safety data, the various adverse effects, and how it was mitigated. But also having insight about clinical trial strategy with patients. I will show you in this use case why PharmaPendium should be your go-to resource to assess all of it. As some of you may know, to reach optimal treatment, repurposed drug may be used at higher dose compared to the indication it is approved for. And it's important not only to know what are the adverse effects that have been reported with the use of these drugs, but also what you can expect if you start increasing the dose. So recently, baricitinib was identified as a possible drug to help fight the cytokine storm, and a clinical phase 3 actually has already started. But the first question we need to answer is, what is the therapeutic dose the medicine was approved for its indication? So for this, I will dive in PharmaPendium and see how I can quickly access this information. So this is the interface of PharmaPendium. And to know the therapeutic dose for baricitinib, I will go to the browse drugs, and then I will put baricitinib, and I will click the drug. Now you see some information about this drug, the brand name, the document where it was extracted from, the biology data we extract from, classes of interest, and primary target. Now, for the sake of the use case, I will go straight to the FDA approval package. I will click right because I don't want to lose this page. Now you can see all the approval package from the FDA. And I will go to the label, and I will go to the latest label iteration. Now I will go quickly to the label, and I see, scrolling down, dosage and administration, the recommended dose of Olumiant is 2 milligrams once daily. So that's great. Now I'll go back to my previous page. And I want to know what are the expected adverse effects at clinically administered dose, but what was reported at higher dose from baricitinib in clinical phase. Because sometimes you need to see how high you can go before you see negative effects on clinical patients. This information doesn't always make it to the labels and can help give you better risk-benefit assessment in clinical trials. So for this, and I'll show you how you can do it very quickly in PharmaPendium. So I'm on that drug page, and for this I will click on drug safety page, and I will click right again. So now what you see here is a table display you'll get for the safety data module, and by default, it will be on clinical phase, which is what we want. You have the drug name, the adverse effects, where the term was normalized to the major taxonomy. So this may not be at the exact term you will see written in the document. And actually the fact that we can link the drug to the adverse effects, to the species, to the dose type, the route, is not an easy thing to do, because oftentimes the information is scattered, sometimes over 100 pages document in very different terms or shape with various synonyms. So we have specialists like Marnix mentioned who properly map out all this information and data, and it will take you a lot of time to cover these documents with the possibility now to miss important information. So before I dive into the document, for COVID patients, you might expect to have a repeated dose strategy. So for this, I will go to the filter on the left-hand side, and I will click repeated dose, and I will apply. So first, what I like to do, I like to scroll down quickly to see if something strikes me out and if there is something of interest at a higher dose. So you can see a lot of reported adverse effects for therapeutic range around 2 to 4 milligrams each day, and some may be reported in the labels. But for drug repurposing, there might not be so much non-information at higher doses. But in PharmaPendium, we do extract that data to give better risk mitigation and help to avoid clinical failure. So I can see here something of interest where thrombocytosis is mentioned as a reported dose of 14 milligrams every day. Now, occurrences of thrombocytosis can be concerning because it can lead to fatal outcome, including stroke, heart attack for your patients, and possibly have an impact on your clinical trials. So, but let's dive into the document to see what context around this adverse effect I can see. And in PharmaPendium, we are very transparent about the source and document we extract the information from, so you can check by yourself not only where we get the information from, but you can go get a lot of more context around this information. So what I like to do is I just click right, and I will get this PDF file. So the strategy I like to do is now I can check through all the documents about thrombocytitis, for example. And what I did, as you can see, I can do that in very few clicks away. I can scan through this document with this adverse effect reported, and I can find quickly the information that I wanted to. And now, you can read here, for example, the thrombocytitis was rated as mild in severity, resolved without intervention. So although, of course, you want to keep monitoring the patient to see indeed if it stays mild and go away, this information gives you more confidence in go, no-go decision to continue the test. And sometimes during real-time test trial, you don't have days or weeks to take this decision, and it can lead to the removal of certain patients and now reducing your patient sample size, which is a problem because now you may not reach statistical significance to validate your study. Or it can simply lead to a pause in your clinical trials, and now you face a final decision on restarting the trial by a medical regulator or committee, which could take weeks. So with PharmaPendium, you can understand within the real time of clinical settings the go, no-go decision you have to make for your patients should you see an expected adverse effect like this one. So let's go back a bit to my results page. So while I was scrolling down, I see some interesting also other adverse effects. Now, what you can do in PharmaPendium is you can scan through like this, or you can export all these results in an Excel spreadsheet. And I've prepared an Excel spreadsheet for you, which is exactly the same that you will see in the results page. And now you can do exactly the same. You can just click on different those that could be interesting. And you will get access to the same source, and you will get access to the same context and data. So while I was scrolling down, I saw something else interesting. I saw adverse effect on death. Now, what you can do in PharmaPendium, on the filter on the left-hand side, if you want to know a bit more about an adverse effect, you can quickly filter about this adverse effect that was normalized on the MEDRA taxonomy. So I will put death, and I will click on sudden death. Now, click apply, and I will have 16 records reported from the regulatory documents. Now, again, I can use the same strategy. I can see at 4 milligrams here, for example, this adverse effect was reported, and you can now dive on the EMA approval document and see a bit more about the context you have around this adverse effect. Now, again, I didn't mention earlier, but you can see what we've done with PharmaPendium. You can search through the document, you can take snapshots, and you can save and so on. Very convenient. But now I want to know a bit more about what I found in the document. So exactly the same way as I did for thrombocytitis, I'm scanning through the documents, and then you see you have 132 documents. But look how quick I can find some really good information. Here I can see that according to the investigator, the cause of death were not considered treatment related. Overall, the cause were heterogeneous deaths due to infection and MACE were rare. Now you can even see above what were the reasons caused death. So you can see how I got access to this information quickly by just applying the strategy I just showed you. So let's go back a bit to the results page. Now, for the sake of the presentation, I've noticed something interesting, and I did a bit of statistical studies, and I saw that neutropenia was an adverse effect that comes back quite often. So I wanted to dive in and understand a bit more about, again, what was around neutropenia adverse effect in the document. And again, I did exactly the same strategy. And I went through a bit of the document. And I saw something of interest. I see here that one subject discontinued from the study to an adverse effect, to an adverse event. Neutropenia in the 5 milligram twice a day cohort. Interesting. So now you have maybe an insight on the strategy of why and how they had to remove these patients. And interestingly, when I went to the label for neutropenia, and I checked neutropenia, I found interesting information. You can see here modified dosage in case of lymphopenia or neutropenia or anemia or treatment initiation criteria. So they had to modify the dosage on the label. So you see, maybe when they were doing the clinical trials, they didn't want to take a risk for patients with neutropenia. So they removed the patient because neutropenia you can have some impaired immune system that can lead to infection. So they didn't want to take any risk and remove this patient from the clinical trials. Now, of course, this use case and flow was quite quick, but this is just to show you like how quick I could get access to this information, more context, and have better risk-benefit mitigation once you want to plan your clinical trials. Thank you. For you, Marnix, now.
Okay, it's back to me. So if you could stop your screen share, then I will start mine.
Cool.
I can do it from here as well. Screen share, so this will take a second. Okay, preparing. Okay, there we go. I should be able to see my screen and PharmaPendium. And let's dive into the second example that we prepared for you, which is around what can we do to avoid medication that could aggravate COVID-19 disease symptoms. So each COVID-19 patient really develop a spectrum of serious, potentially lethal conditions. And for treatment of COVID-19 or COVID-19 symptoms, we really would like to avoid any medication that could aggravate these conditions because they're very, very sensitive. So for example, if we're going to apply an antibiotic to treat a lung infection, we would like to avoid medication that maybe could further aggravate, let's say, breathing difficulties, which is a very common, let's say, condition with COVID-19 patients. Now, this question is something that we can very nicely address using PharmaPendium FAIRS data. Let me go here. Zoom in a bit for you. So next to extracted content, PharmaPendium delivers access to FDA Adverse Events Reporting System data, also known as FAIRS data. And this database we have integrated into PharmaPendium that will really allow you to segment the FAIRS data based on really unique filters, visualization, and really allow you, for example, also to compare adverse event profiles and patient populations as well. So let's dive into the FAIRS data and PharmaPendium and see how we can answer this question. Now we end up at a selection page where we can basically choose between a summary table and graphical view and a direct FAIRS search. Now this summary table and graphical view will allow us to build graphs and tables where we can build comparative overviews and where we can compare adverse event profiles of drugs and, for example, different subpopulations. However, for this example, let's work with the direct FAIRS search here and click on Start. And with this direct FAIRS search, we can really limit our search for FAIRS data based on quite a few things. For example, we can limit our search based on drug reported role, primary, secondary, concomitant, or interacting. We can limit based on date range or age range, gender, and if the outcome is serious or non-serious. And all these things are typically reported by the people submitting their reports to the FDA. In this example, let's specifically select or limit on serious outcome. Now, of course, as mentioned, one of the severe symptoms of COVID-19 is breathing difficulties, and we would like to identify what drugs have breathing difficulties reported as adverse effects so we can potentially avoid using these drugs. Now, to identify these records, let's then open up PharmaPendium's adverse events taxonomy. This taxonomy is really based on MEDRA that we also use for our extracted preclinical and clinical data that Thomas also showed, thereby really delivering this unique translational view from preclinic to clinic to post-market. Now, at this top view, let's open up the top view, respiratory, thoracic, and mediastinal disorders, and maybe select lower respiratory tract disorders. So all the drugs that we want to know all the drugs that have this as a reported adverse effect. If you want, you can always dive in deeper into this taxonomy and select lower level terms if they are more relevant for you. And let's click on done. So within just a few clicks, we've recovered 234,000 records of FAERS data. And for each of these records, we have a lot of data. It's case ID, what's the primary suspect drug, what are the other administered drugs, where we even specify concomitant or secondary suspect. We have adverse event data. And I would like to point your attention to that we, of course, age data available if reported and what the reported occupation is. Now we have a lot of filters available to trim this data that's sound to really get a specific answer to our question. And maybe the first filter could be, maybe for this example, we are only interested in high quality reports submitted by healthcare professionals. So we have a reporter occupation filter available where, for example, we can say only want reports by healthcare professionals, other healthcare professionals, pharmacists, physicians, and registered nurses, where we then ignore consumer reports as well as lawyer reports. And we click on apply. Now, as mentioned, especially elderly patients are especially susceptible to COVID-19, to become really ill from COVID-19. So we can also filter this data specifically on, let's say, the aged people. So under the age range filter, we can say 65 years or more and click on apply. So now we've basically efficiently trimmed down our records to 58,203 records of FAERS data. And we could ask ourselves, so we have all these primary suspect drugs here, to what drug classes do these belong? So what drug classes could potentially pose a risk for my patients? So under the filter drugs by role, we can look at the drug classes to which these primary suspect drugs belong. And what we can see is that there's a lot of drug classes in there that are frequently used to treat COVID-19 symptoms mostly. For example, disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, immune modulators, and analgesics as well. And we can see there's also the class of antibiotics. And 2,000 of the records available that we currently look at are on this class of antibiotics. So let's select this and click apply. And now we could ask ourselves, okay, so which are now really the drugs in this drug class of antibiotics? By click on drug name, click on primary suspect drug, and we get an overview of all the antibiotics that fit within our filters that we applied and have the adverse effect, lower respiratory tract disorders. And for example, we can see here that there's 338 cases where this was reported where daptomycin was a primary suspect drug. So we have a really nice overview of the drugs here that have this particular adverse event in this particular population. So that would be, then maybe daptomycin might be drugs you would like to further investigate to decide if you might want to avoid this drug. And that's just within a few clicks. Now, if you want, you can really dive into the original record as well and learn more about start date, stop date is available, and the duration, dosing that was applied, and further information on this patient. Let me quickly go back here. So now, in just a few minutes, really using PharmaPendium FAERS data and unique taxonomies and filters, I've really pulled up all reports that link a drug to lower respiratory tract failure, where the patient is 65 years or older, and reports have been submitted by healthcare professionals. And this really helps me to decide, for example, what antibiotics to avoid on COVID-19 patients based on post-market data. Now, this, of course, does not deliver a black and white answer. We probably need to investigate further. And from here, for example, we could, let me just take a quick shortcut here on this daptomycin. We can decide to dive into, for example, the label by going to the drug page and dive into the label and investigate if there's anything mentioned there. Or we can explore, for example, pharmacokinetic, metabolizing enzyme and transporter data on these drugs and drug safety, preclinical and clinical drug safety data, as well to make those informed decisions. Okay, so this was an example how we can use PharmaPendium FAIRS data for identifying drugs that you might want to avoid for treating COVID-19 patients. And let's then dive into the second question, which is really more around efficacy data. And here the question is how to find approved drugs that have already been tested against COVID-19 symptoms or endpoints, where we could potentially bypass a very long and expensive regulatory procedure. Now, many COVID-19 patients at intensive care develop bacterial infections, often due to prolonged intubation. And the question is, what drugs can I use to treat it? And I would like to emphasize that these are real examples coming from PharmaPendium users, healthcare professionals in this case. There's various approaches to answer this question. Today, I would like to show you how you can find this information by browsing for drug by indication. And that way we can effectively identify drugs that have been tested against or approved for a certain indication. Let me pull up PharmaPendium again and go back. So let's dive into PharmaPendium and go for browse, as Thomas done before, but now we're not going to browse for drugs, but we're going to browse for drugs by indication. And here we can access PharmaPendium's indication taxonomy. And this indication taxonomy will really allow us to specifically identify drugs that have been tested against and or approved for a certain indication. And we can either browse to find our term and relevant search depth, or we can type the term of interest. And in this case, let's just look for bacterial upper. And it will also complete this for me, bacterial upper respiratory tract infection. And if we select this category, basically within just a few clicks, we have identified 31 drugs. Let me just show them all to you. That have been tested against this indication. And in this really powerful indication drug association table, we really show you where we have identified this drug indication association. If we have extracted data from FDA label or EMA annex, this means that the drug has been approved for this indication. However, as mentioned, we really read through the full regulatory documents, and we could also find certain indications being tested in other parts of the document. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have been approved for this indication. So that's a bit, so there's really a lot of additional information beyond just reading through the label. We've also identified drug indication associations from kind of very old documents, and in PharmaPendium terms, that's called FDA classics, as well as from DESI documents as well. And if available, we also extract content from MOSBI's, MITRES. In this case, efficacy data and efficacy EMA means that this data was found in other parts of the document, not the label or annex. Of course, this is very valuable data for repurposing, and getting this overview without PharmaPendium would require you to read through all available EMA and FDA regulatory documents, which is, of course, an impossible exercise. And now we really have done this work for you, so you just have this overview now in a few clicks. Maybe for our example, we are only interested in drugs that have been approved for bacterial upper respiratory tract infections. And we can select these by selecting the sources. And in this case, just let's select the sources FDA label and EMA annex. And we click on apply. And this will effectively trim down our table of 31 drugs to 6, where 5 drugs have been approved for this condition in the US, and one of these drugs has been approved for this condition in the EU. And from here, we can, of course, scroll down a bit. One thing we can do, we can, again, dive into the full information we have available on those drugs. For example, we can dive into this approval package and read more about this association in the label. Or we can dive, for example, into pharmacokinetic data, metabolizing enzyme and transporter data, drug safety data, efficacy data, as well as FAERS data that we have available on those 31 drugs. And especially when we talk about efficacy data, we have a lot of endpoint data in there, which is a nice bridge to the next example that I would like to show you. Let me pull up that slide for you as well. There we go. Which is, let's say, how to find approved drugs that have already been tested against COVID-19 symptoms, but specifically now endpoints, which is kind of more explorative, and which is kind of different from the previous example as well, where we really looked for drugs that were approved for symptoms. Here we would like to look for drugs that are approved, but have been tested at symptoms, or let's say endpoints that were relevant for us. And we could ask ourselves the question, what drugs have been evaluated against endpoints that could be relevant for COVID-19 infection? In this case, for example, let's take a look at viral load. And before diving in too much, diving in here, let me quickly get up the right slide. What is a primary endpoint? It could maybe needs a bit of introduction. So I really like this description from this FDA slide deck. The only reason that a patient would want to take a drug is if it would improve survival, result in a detectable benefit, or the decreased chances of developing a condition. And this is kind of the definition of the primary endpoint. It should be a direct measure of one of these. And it's important that it's determined before the clinical study runs. So you need to decide on this beforehand, what you're going to test against, what you're going to measure. And a clinical trial will be a kind of a test to meet a specific primary endpoint. For example, as an example here, disease-free progression. And with this correct endpoint selection can mean the difference between trial success and failure. So you want to take, so you really would like to do a good job here. Now, getting access to, if you would like to, my next point was, if you would like to know more about endpoints, endpoint selection in PharmaPendium, I would suggest to watch the recording of the webinar we did on the 7th of May, where we talk more about working with, in more detail, working with endpoints in PharmaPendium. Now, endpoint information is notoriously hard to find, and identifying all the drugs that have been tested against an endpoint of interest, again, would require you to read through all available FDA and EMA regulatory documents, which is, of course, an impossible exercise. And maybe you would like to, maybe even imagine you would have done that, and you ask yourself, okay, let's try and do this now for a different endpoint. You can start all over again. So now to really help you out here, we've read through all EMA and FDA approval packages for you and manually extracted out endpoint and other efficacy information and made that data available and discoverable using our in-house developed endpoint taxonomy. Now, let's dive into this question. Basically, endpoint data in PharmaPendium is part of PharmaPendium's efficacy data module. So let's dive in here and look at the efficacy data search window. Here we can limit our search based on drug belonging to a certain class, based on primary target or by an indication. And further, we can easily limit our search based on indication type, species, and the sources where we extracted the data from. And of course, we can limit based on endpoints. So by clicking on this, we get endpoint to our unique endpoint taxonomy that was really developed together with industry partners. And we can start browsing from these top-level categories, for example, or we can really type our term of interest. In this case, let's just type viral load. Now, this will pull up all the terms in this taxonomy that contain the term viral load. And you can see we have a lot of data here, and especially a lot of lower level terms here, overall relapse rate, We call this category, the lower level terms, endpoint tested, and these are exactly the endpoints that were reported in the regulatory document. This was specific request by a development partner, so you have transparency on what was reported. We then aggregated data into endpoint subtypes, which get aggregated again into endpoint types. Now, selecting the right categories is a bit of work because we have quite a bit of data here. So I just kind of preloaded the data here for you under endpoints, and let's click on search. Now, within just a few clicks, PharmaPendium delivers over 22,000 lines of efficacy data where viral load was tested as primary or secondary endpoint. And you can see that we extract a lot of useful data around study design, study number, the species, the dosing, indication, duration. So there's a lot of information here. Also, the number of patients in the trial, as well as endpoint types. Now, of course, the number of patients enrolled is, of course, quite critical, as each patient can be up to $20,000 or more, and you would like to not use too many patients because it's getting very expensive, and you don't want to minimize the number of patients to go too low and thereby endangering statistical significance. Now, the question was which drugs have been tested against the endpoint viral load. By simply clicking on Show Drugs In, we can see that there are 75 drugs in this table that have been tested against this this endpoint, and that's of course a really great starting point for further exploration. Now, within a few minutes, we really got this answer. And again, getting this answer without PharmaPendium would require you to read through all FDA and EMA approval documents, which is basically millions of pages. And from here, of course, we can dive back into the FDA approval package, find interesting reviewer comments. We can look at the other data sources available and take it from there. And of course, we can also trim down this data set using intuitive set of filters, for example, around endpoints where you can see, okay, I'm only specifically interested in, I should say, the primary or secondary endpoints where you only want to have primary endpoints, for example. Now with that, I'm going to keep an eye on the time as well. Let me quickly round up here for you. So what I've shown you today is that really PharmaPendium delivers really critical extracted drug safety data on approved drugs that can inform dosing strategies during repurposing, that it delivers post-market adverse event data that can be uniquely segmented to support decision on what medications to avoid, and that it delivers expertly extracted efficacy data, including this really unique endpoint data to identify approved drugs that could be candidates for treatment of COVID-19 or, of course, COVID-19 symptoms. And thereby it delivers critical access to data to support decision-making for repurposing of approved drugs for COVID-19. Now, PharmaPendium isn't exclusively limited to efficacy and drug safety data. There's much more data so in PharmaPendium. So next to full text search of regulatory content and extracted safety and efficacy data, we have multiple other important data sources in PharmaPendium, which include pharmacokinetic data, metabolizing enzyme and transporter data, as well as a DDI risk calculator that predicts DDI risk in line with the FDA recommendations. Now, these resources are, of course, also crucial for repurposing and treatment of COVID-19. And if this is of interest to you, please sign up for the follow-up webinar, where we will focus on DMPK data and predicting DDI risk with PharmaPendium in the context of COVID-19. You can find this webinar in our webinar channel, but I also provided a link in the attachments section under the video player. Now, let me check if there is currently any questions. Okay, and I should be setting up a scope. Let me see how this works. If you would like us to follow up with you, let me see. Click yes. I've activated the vote now. You can simply click yes, and if you think not really necessary, you can just ignore this. And in the meantime, there is two questions coming in, Thomas, and maybe you can take them. about does PharmaPendium contain data on drugs that are currently in clinical trials?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No. So PharmaPendium doesn't cover the drugs that are currently in the clinical trials or not approved yet.
Okay. And then I see there's another question. I think that's probably the last one that we'll take before rounding up is how often is the data in PharmaPendium updated, and how long does it take for you to get the data in PharmaPendium?
So we have documents are updated every 2 weeks. Manually extracted data are updated every month. For the most of the data extracted, we do.
All right. Okay. Yes, if there's any further questions, feel free to drop us an email or send us a message. So we're happy to get back to you. And as we kind of ran out of time now, I would like to thank you for your attention and hopefully see you around for the next session. Thank you very much and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.